We are in the midst of a very important discussion where Sri Aurobindo is showing us the means by which one can develop the surface outer personality in a way that we can make a smooth transition into the next life without losing the character of this outer personality. A richly diverse, complex, developed instrumentation which is integrated would be that much more useful for the divine action in the world. And so one could have, for example, developed a very narrow skill in the personality or a narrow facet of personality, and it will be useful in a narrow track. But life is multifaceted, and the best service we could provide to the divine is to have a basis on which the divine could act in a multifaceted framework, in a multifaceted action through the same center of individuality. And so, we have seen previously Sri Aurobindo's description of how the soul's personality develops across lives. It puts forward a frontal personality which now remains as an imprint in the soul's personality, next time putting a different personality in the front which remains within, and another, and across lives it is as if the soul is developing multifaceted possibilities of its soul personality. If each of these has been now richly developed, and the soul now can put forward the full richness of these in the current personality, here is a person who not only is skillful in music, not only in painting, not only has a clear power of logical thinking, has a power of articulation, has a strength of character, has great powerful leadership capacities, can equally follow and serve without needing to assert individuality. And you can see a rich, multifaceted personality integrated enough around the aspiration that so much more could be done through this. I am reminded of one person in our school who was one of the most extraordinary such persons that I have seen, at least in the domain of arts, and having also a very developed intellect. She was a teacher for us, and I would say she was one of the best teachers in our entire school who fully understood what Mother intended in the new approach to education. And Mother gave her a lot of prominence, a lot of opportunities, trained her personally in dramatics. She was the lead player in many of the dramas. She was given the role of Savitri in many of the plays. And Mother would teach her how to develop, how to work, how to express certain nuances of emotions and consciousness. And I have seen in the years that we had interacting with her, and subsequently later on also, she could take, for example, a poem of Sri Aurobindo and go deep into it in a way that most people cannot, and then make relations from there to the field of art, to music, and to organize all these connections in such a clear, coherent, and a rational language without diluting any of the artistry and subtlety and nuance of it. Just seeing that was such a delight, and I can say I've yet to meet somebody in whom all these facets were so well organized. And unfortunately, as it happened, she lost her balance at some point. And it was obviously because of some internal conflict. But the Mother seems to have foreseen even that possibility, and whenever she would bless her, she would put her hand especially on the left side of the head. And so it was unusual, and I heard this from people around who had seen that. It was as if she had sensed that possibility, and there was some weakness in the character, and she was trying to mitigate that flaw. But she remains to this day one of the most integrated personalities that I have seen in this sense. Many people who came here in the early days of the ashram had not only rich possibilities, but found those possibilities flowering. I've mentioned one example of a young man who had come with no particular development. He had an artistic bent, and that was all. And within 2 years, he was spouting very high grade of poetry, playing music on the sitar of an exceptional level, singing beautifully, and with a well-developed intellect. And Sri Aurobindo points to that as an example in his letters to Nirodbaran, saying this kind of a sudden rich flowering out cannot be explained by normal means of evolution. And the only reason it is possible is because of the yoga force working within. The yoga force can take the personality and draw out what is there as latent and richly develop and integrate much more rapidly than the normal evolutionary process. The practical result, though, is from the soul's perspective, here is a vehicle which is so well developed. But Sri Aurobindo uses one more word here. If our mental being came to be so powerfully individualized on the surface, and powerfully individualized has a suggestion here, that the individuality so developed now is not only multifaceted, but has a power of action, can be effective in a way that is powerful for the soul, that it puts forward an intention, an aspiration, or a push of inspiration, and the personality takes it to a powerful result. So we see another factor which is required for this effective action. Not only the individualization, not only a rich, multifaceted development, but powerfully individualized on the surface. So from the soul's perspective, you can see this is something worth preserving, and it would want to keep it. The second facet was so much one with the inner mind and inner mental Purusha. This integration between the outer personality and the inner layers. And what would it mean? Having a rich, powerful personality on the surface, individualized, who leads it? What drives the motives of this person? And it's very easy for an individualization now to become egoistically individualized. I am so great, I am so powerful, I want to fulfill myself, because from the very beginning and in early childhood, every time that I wanted to do something, I could get it done because of my skill, because of my individualization. And the result is the ego tends to get an exaggerated dominance in the very early formations of the personality. And it means it prevents the inner influence of the psychic being from directly connecting to the surface personality. Now we have seen, if you observe little children, you will see at the age in early childhood, kindergarten, primary levels, all children tend naturally to look up to the most vitally developed child. The one who has the greatest vitality becomes the natural leader. He does not need to have any higher faculties at that time. It is the vitality that the child instinctively respects. One person asserts and others, even if they disagree, become quiet or quietly follow. Later on, the intellect comes into its own, and at that point the power of the intellect which can argue out becomes fascinating, and such a person may become a reference point. But in none of these is there obviously in the child an attraction to a higher value. If there has not been from an early stage a reference to the inner values, if there has not been a climate that encourages introspection and the higher, more sensitive elements of your personality, the deeper influence, very quickly this very rigid formation on the surface will come as a block. If the inner soul is sufficiently evolved, it may create a crisis of life, invoke an action which shocks the outer personality, momentarily breaks it, breaks the ego center to allow something of the inner to come forward. Again, where I have seen examples of this, people who are very competent, very capable, having a great shock, suddenly it made them question. And in the moment of the shock, the psychic influence came forward to warn the surface. Something is wrong. And it pulled enough that the person got partly interiorized and began to wonder, why did this happen? Where did I go wrong? And began a deep introspection which perhaps was enough to bridge and allow the inner influence to come forward. But the inner mental, which holds all the possibilities of the outer, but which is also responsive to the psychic influence, this needs to be bridged sufficiently with the outer mind personality. Now we, practically for us, could do this by a conscious inward turning in meditation, or by a conscious stilling and silencing of the surface activity of the mind to become conscious of some deeper layer behind, which is normally covered by the activity of the mind. That itself can be a kind of meditation. It may not be consciously intended to go very deep, but simply holding that is enough to allow the inner influences to come forward. Or even more directly, to turn your thoughts bit by bit and organize them around your deepest center of aspiration or deepest inner values. Such an inward turn and a conscious reference of submission of the outer formed mind to this influence would be the way by which we would assist this integration to take place. The individualization, I don't speak of too much, because finally it's a question of, well, we can also touch upon this. Ideally, the individualization would be made consciously by us, by an active reference, again, to our highest aspiration or the deepest influence. It means every morning, before you begin your day, you take trouble to become conscious of your deeper aspiration. Now it's easy to do your prayer, you have to rush, you rush and go, but you take trouble to become conscious of a center or the center, or even its reflection in your thoughts and ideals, or in the feeling of love for the divine, or the devotion or gratitude to the divine. By whatever means that you can connect yourself to the psychic influence or the spiritual influence, and then turn to look at the day and all that you're going to do from that poise of connection. View what you plan to do in a reference to this, and perhaps already certain things will shift. And then at the end of the day again, review all that was done from the perspective of your deeper aspiration. And in this way, you are compelling all activities to gradually become connected as if threads drawn to this central influence. As a result, the individualization around the true center will become more and more complete. This effort would be the first. The inward turn to the inner mind and inner mental Purusha, becoming conscious of the center of your mind, would be the second effort. So we spoke of bridging the outer mind with inner mind, but he says also, and inner mental Purusha. That means becoming conscious of that poise where you stand back from your thoughts, become an observer of the thoughts, yourself not actively in thought, but simply aware, and hold that poise. And this becoming as if a supporting base at the back of the whole mind's individuality is the integration required to bring forward this influence. And then the third requirement, which is almost as if contrary to these, which are all individualizing and bringing together, the third requirement at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite. It does not mean we have to become conscious of the infinite. It does not mean that you have become entirely plastic in one go. It means you are open plastically to that action and that influence. That whatever content of that influence comes upon you, you are able to adjust, even if with some effort. And bit by bit, as the influences come from the infinite, in whichever facet, whichever way, very simply put, whatever challenges life places upon you, and to which you are required to adapt, you make effort to adapt and open to the challenge without resisting, without opposing, without locking yourself in limits, saying, I cannot, it is beyond me. So, to be open plastically to the action of that. It's not enough that you're open plastically to the life pressure. That's the first step. You must eventually extend this openness to the action of the higher influence of consciousness. What does that mean? When, for example, there is, in a state of concentration, meditation, or aspiration, a certain descent of some presence, some calm, peace, joy, or some experience of opening of your heart to the Divine Mother or the Divine Presence in love or gratitude. Whenever there's an experience of this kind, we tend to contain the experience within the boundaries of our limited awareness. I feel love for the Divine and I lock myself into this picture that I have, into this warmth which I feel in my chest. It stops there. Into this particular way that I have to relate, and it stops there. In fact, when the experience comes, it will always tend to overflow boundaries. And if you're conscious and plastic, you allow that overflow to take place. It's not only in the chest, it spreads into your whole being and beyond the boundaries of your body. Or you feel this relationship and the relationship widens until you feel not just this narrow image, but you feel the presence of the Divine everywhere. It's as if opening out to a wide presence of the Divine Mother. Eventually, even the form begins to dissolve and there is only this vast form or formless vast, whichever way it happens. It will tend to happen. But a personality which is too narrow will reduce it always to the narrow picture. It's the reason why practices which bind you to a very narrow focus are not helpful for this purpose. There are people who will say in meditation, I imagine a picture of the mother in my heart, I imagine the mother's feet, or I repeat a mantra. It's good as a starting point, but you have to widen until the experience is simply you as the center of awareness, whether in the mind, whether in the heart or something deeper within of the psychic presence. You as a center opening out to the Divine which is all, which is everywhere, above, around, within, below, everywhere, in all things. And it is in such a kind of a wide opening that you become now able to receive the influence of the infinite. And when you receive that imprint, something shapes you, you allow yourself to be shaped plastically. So, at the same time, so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite. And the infinite will progressively push, nudge, gently, and that's fine. We do not need to become instantly the perfectly plastic. You will be guided. Sri Aurobindo refers to this process in the little booklet, The Mother, where he says that for the action you need three things: consciousness, plasticity, and surrender. And then he explains, the more you become conscious, the more you can become plastic. Because you cannot be plastic in parts where you're not conscious. But then the more the plasticity turns to give itself in a movement of surrender, the movement of the Divine Shakti entering and working in you will make you more plastic. So it is necessarily a progressive process where becoming conscious and allowing yourself to be shaped allows for a higher power to shape you and to make you more plastic. And then it builds and builds and builds, increasingly by the action of that influence, not so much by your own effort. Simply your opening and allowing it to act becomes now the means. So in all three requirements, you will see the basic spiritual practices are inherent. And so when finally these three are fulfilled to whatever degree, that the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form of mind and create a new one in order to progress. Effectively, it would be such that when the soul says, now I need a different kind of experience, this personality can shape itself to adapt to that different kind of experience. I have again an example that comes to mind, which we have all had at some point or other experienced. When you play a role on a stage, in a theatre, you'll find naturally your temperament fits a particular type of role. But when you're challenged to play a contrary role, you struggle, you resist, you feel shy, you feel embarrassed. If you observe carefully, there's a part within you which resists flowing to become something which is so different. And if you can adjust yourself and accept and make the effort, it's one of the best exercises to make plastic your surface personality and literally experience many kinds of life. I believe that some of the modern tools, such as cinema, television, or now the video which you can watch on your mobile screen, are means which could be powerfully used for this purpose, in the sense that when we watch, we tend to identify with some characters, generally the lead characters whom we feel affinity with. And in that identification, we tend to absorb certain elements of that consciousness. If we watch then selectively various kinds of uplifting characters, and Sri Aurobindo highly recommended characters from history which are inspiring because they carry a force also of the historic reality. When you identify with them in this way, it's as if imprinting in you something, shaping in you something. And even on a deep level, the soul can have the enjoyment of that kind of life without needing to actually take birth and follow through with it. I remember once we had a movie here in the playground, which was of a submarine, and a very heroic movie of the people in the submarine fighting to survive and the challenges they faced and the dangers in which they were living. At any moment, the whole thing could explode. They were going through dangerous territory. And I remember after going through that whole experience, when the film ended, for a moment I was not sure whether I was that person or this person. And it struck me, I just experienced a lifetime's growth. Had I been one of those characters in the submarine going through that heroic action, the growth of that would have been the imprint of the lifetime of the person. All the other elements which were there, the growth of the person as they grew up in whatever culture they were in, the training for this and all the rest after retirement, is irrelevant. This was the imprint, the heroism of that, the courage or whatever it was. And the imprint of that was there in me as if I had lived it. And that's when it became clear that this can actually become a means to assist this movement, not only to plastify your personality, but even for the soul to absorb much more. All of this comes to a stage where literally your personality can reshape itself, or at least the core of it. The most hardened surface part may still be dropped, but the core of it being sufficiently plastic, the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form of mind and create a new one in order to progress. This should be our objective immediately as far as we can go, and to whatever degree we are able to do this, integrating the mind with the inner presence of the divine, to that extent and in that part, in the skills developed in that part, even in the memories of that part, the soul would have something worth carrying over into the next, at least as a nucleus of personality around which to form the new one. A similar individualization, integration, and openness of the vital being on the surface would alone make possible a similar survival of the life part in us. The outer vital personality, representative of the inner life being, the vital Purusha. Exactly the same thing at the vital. Which means, in the domain of our emotions, this is the part where we are most conscious of the vital. The vital itself is a band of which the emotions are the uppermost layer. It's the part where the vital energies interface with the mind. That's what we call emotions. And they have a high character of mental awareness because you're conscious of the emotions. If you descend at lower gradations, they become often dulled emotions or unconscious emotions or impulses, until at its lowest level the vital spans all the way down to the physical instincts. Now it means all the life energies, from physical instincts all the way to the mental emotions. That's the range of the vital personality. Observe a person carefully. You will see the primary character of a person is formed in the vital. The way they think sits on top of that. If you are asked to describe a person, I'm going to meet somebody with whom I am going to have the most critical discussion of my career, my life, or whatever. And I ask you as the person's best friend, tell me what to expect. Whom am I going to meet? And you will effectively end up describing all the person's instinctive behaviors. Likes, dislikes, what he reacts to, what he is drawn to, what will make him more pacified, what will make him more upset. Be careful, do not speak of this. This is a sensitive point. The person will completely turn against you. But all of this description, none of which, or very little of which, will touch the way the person thinks. Or if that is there, it will be largely the result of the emotional imprint or life energy instincts. Even their physical body will often be imprinted by the life force. When a person has a large quantum of life force, the body will tend to follow. If the person has a restless life energy, the body will tend to follow, and so on. So this is really the nexus, Sri Aurobindo says, of the ego of the personality. It is in the vital. And Sri Aurobindo gives to this one simple line summary, which is a replica of what we did with the mind, but now in the vital. But you'll see he spent more time describing it in the mind, because the mind is something you're conscious of and it is more plastic. Entering the vital, you're not conscious of it. It is much less plastic, much more bound in its stickiness. It is also elastic, but sticky in its elasticity. So a similar individualization is needed in the vital. What does it mean for the vital to be individualized? And it is something which one has to consciously work upon. One method by which you can develop it is become conscious of the life energy within you. Now, you actually set aside your mind, thought, awareness, simply become conscious of the life energy within you, and it takes a while, it takes a little practice to be able to come into that. You will feel at that point gradually, yes, emotions are a part of this me, as well as the instincts of the body, the impulsiveness which drives me, the overall imprint of my enthusiasm and life push and joy of life, etc., are all part of this. And you settle yourself consciously in this. And once you're able to do this consciously, become very quiet, very still in your life energies. Until at some point you become aware as if a kind of a quiet backdrop of the energy. In the energy, but also of the energy. It is the part of the energy which is still. upon which all these activities happen. And then you lean back consciously more and more into the stillness of the energy. And then you stay in that. And as you begin to stay in that, you become conscious that this is the supporting base. This is separate from the movement of the energy. From this poise, you can even reshape your energy habits by imprinting or imposing its stillness, its clarity into the rest of it. And it's an exercise which one has to work upon over days, weeks. Many people who are used to working with energies in the martial arts or other kinds of energy-based activities indirectly develop this poise, but not always consciously. But at least they will know what it's like to be in this state, but they still have to work to settle themselves in that part which is still. And then you feel the individualization there. Which means what? What is the nucleus, the center around which all this energy flows? First you come to the stillness, and then in the stillness, one becomes aware of a kind of sense of center around which everything flows, or from which everything seems to be flowing. If you have some sense of your deeper aspiration and of the psychic presence, from there you can turn to that and invoke that aspiration and that influence into this center, and through this center into the rest of your vital being, vital personality. And stay like this. The practical result will be the individualization and the inward integration. And then into this to bring plasticity. Mother has developed in the ashram what was described to me by Dr. Kirit Joshi as the most comprehensive physical training program in the world, he said. And in a way, if you look at all the activities that children are led through, it is true. But for what purpose? Not only for the body consciousness, but particularly for the life energies. When you exercise the life energies and impulses in all these different directions, you're forcing them to become plastic. You're teaching them to become adjusting to any challenge. I remember a few years ago, there was the National Geographic TV channel had organized a competition in which they invited people from all over India to pass through a preliminary filter, and then they would all be part of some kind of combination of activities in nature. The person who came first in that competition was a woman, not a man, and that woman was a former student from the ashram school. And looking at her, you could see that her vitality was not only plastic, but it was clear and conscious. It's one of the few that you could say, yes, this one has clear vital energy, which is also plastic. And the fact that she came through and became the winner was obvious. I saw the other people who came second and third, none of them had that clarity and plasticity of the vital energy. I don't know what direction her life has taken her, but very likely it will be in this space where the vital energies can flow freely, and because she will tend to enjoy that special skill that she has. But it gives you a sense of what it means when the vital is plastic. You can throw it into any situation. And they deliberately created situations which were unexpected, which people could not have gone through even if they were used to trekking and going out into nature. Challenges which were unexpected, and immediately a conscious plastic vitality would adapt to it. So this is broadly what we can discuss of the similar process being taken into the vital body, to the extent that we are able to do. And again, we did not need to become perfect. To the extent we are able to do, to that extent the soul can carry that nucleus of the vital personality into the next. And if it has been sufficiently extended into the surface parts, then those also could carry in a vital personality memory, and substance into the next life. You would then be born with a certain turn of mind which is conscious of the sense of life purpose, a certain turn of vital energy which should also be refined and conscious of the sense of purpose. And as the personality of the physical body develops, at each step it would be infused with this special capacity and grow eventually to fill it completely into full adulthood, where you would have the sense of continuity from the past into the new life. It doesn't mean you will remember everything, because it may not be important. It doesn't mean that you will have the same habits or tendencies, because that is not what the soul wants. It wants a different imprint. It does not want you to replicate that. But you will have the sense of continuity. It is the same person that I was, and it is the same direction of life fulfillment that I am continuing, with a very different shape and priority in my personality, but the same personality. Now, having completed this part of the discussion, Sri Aurobindo elaborates on what it means to bridge the outer and inner. What would really happen then is that the wall between the inner self and the outer man would have broken down. And the permanent mental and vital being within, from within, the mental and vital representatives of the immortal psychic entity would govern the life. So here we need to look at the schema of the personality as Sri Aurobindo describes it. And remember, a drawing, a framework, is only a way for the mind to recognize. And we will see that you can blur the distinctions here and view it all as a continuity. But let's look at what is meant here. Remember, you, the real you, is the psychic being, the immortal psychic entity. It is not bound to the mind or the vital or the physical. It takes upon itself, like clothing, substance of mind, substance of the vital, and eventually substance of the physical, which is in the formed child, half formed or fully formed. But when it takes the substance, that substance has to organize itself around some focus. And if the psychic being is taking the substance around it, remember, it's the psychic being which is the focus. But it is not of the substance of mind. So what happens? It's as if a reflection of its center forms in the mind substance. So if I take an analogy here, with my hand I pick up a lump of mud and hold it. Let's say it's a very big mud or rock. There's the point of the big pile which my hand supports. That is the closest to my hand. It's also the center of the balance in which I hold the rock or the object, isn't it? If I shift that center of the balance, the whole object could tilt or fall. This point of support is still my hand but not rock. It's the part where it touches rock. But it becomes for the rock effectively the point of support. So in the mind, which is mind substance which is gathered to form the mind personality, there is the support of the psychic around which this is gathered, but the psychic is not in the mind. Its representation or reflection in the mind substance forms like a center of I am aware of my mind awareness by reflection. And it is this which Sri Aurobindo is referring to as the mental representative of the immortal psychic entity. It is the part in your mind, if you feel subjectively, the part in your mind where your mind feels, not only I'm conscious, but my consciousness feels as if it is immortal. It feels as if I was never born or will never die. Of course, when I turn to my body awareness, I can say yes. In my memory, I can say yes, there was a starting point. But the feeling of the consciousness itself is like, I'm always, I'm eternal. And it's a reflection of the psychic in the center of the mind's awareness. When you take the position of the mental Purusha as a witness, it is around this that one centers, or deeper behind this to its real, more essential core that you get to. So if you think of it in these terms, in order to manage the mental substance that has been gathered, the psychic, so to say, puts forward a center in the mind, which is its representative, or a center forms in the mind, which is its representative. Around this, there are layers. Similar thing in the vital, a reflected center, which would be the center of the vital personality, representing the immortal psychic. But the moment you have a center in the mind, I am conscious, I am not the psychic, it takes charge. And similarly in the vital, all the instincts of the vital tend to form and coalesce around this center. So it feels like I am upset because somebody threatened me. And the vital center now seizes the focus of the personality. And finally, when you enter the physical body, all these two layers of substance entering the physical get dulled down and tend to identify with the body awareness. I am the body that is thinking, that is feeling, that is upset. I am the center in the body. In the process, what has happened is the sense of these centers has got so separated from the psychic, who formed these around itself, that a gap effectively forms. The psychic still was the one who gathered it, but in the very act of gathering and fixing into the physical body, they acquired a tendency of dullness and rigidity and automatism of their own. And now the psychic can put an influence. Its influence will be there, but as an influence, it can only be one of many influences. There are many more influences from the environment and influences from within of old habits and inheritance and all those tendencies which are all influences. Which will lead, which will be the more prominent, depends on the quality of the material, depends on how well it is organized, and so on. If the material is clear, transparent, not dulled by the body's dullness, then the influence of the psychic light, it's like an awareness filling, would be stronger. If the individualization is made with a clear center, then the psychic can seize upon the center and through the center affect everything else. So what can happen is in my mind, for example, in the center of my mind, I know that this is not going to be good for me. But in the rest of my personality, I can't help it. I have to do it. I can't miss this opportunity. And I'm pulled by things. But if this center is there, which is clear enough knowing, after I've passed through that experience and perhaps suffered consequences, this center can say, yes, I told you. That becomes what we call conscience. Something inside me as a reflection of the psychic inside the personality, touching some part of the emotional mental center, is the conscience. But it's not it. But it is there at least as a reference because there was sufficient clarity in the personality. So what Sri Aurobindo is describing now is the breakdown of the wall between this formed outer personality and the psychic presence within, which feels now quite distanced from the personality, or the personality feels quite unconnected to the psychic presence. And the wall in between is this gap, the inability of each to feel the other or act upon the other, for the inner to act upon the outer. So when he describes this breakdown, you see what he says. What would really happen then is that the wall between the inner self and the outer man would have broken down, and the permanent mental and vital being from within, the mental and vital representatives of the immortal psychic entity, would govern the life. So what seizes charge of the mental body is the reflection of the psychic or the psychic representative in the mind. Similarly, the vital would be governed by the representative influence of the psychic in the vital center. Both now becoming as if two layers as instruments of the psychic influence. Remember, the psychic itself is neither mind nor vital. So it needs still this interface, the point where the hand holds and grips that material. And so these would govern our life. Our mind nature and our life nature could then be a continuous progressive expression of the soul and not a nexus of successive formations preserved only in their essence. What is the present situation is our mind nature and life nature are successive formations. One life and then different life has a different mind and life nature. What links them? The nexus, the link point between all of these. So there is a nexus, a series of progressive, successive formations. Only in their essence something is carried over. This is the nexus which is linking them. But when this essence now grows out to fill the entire nature, your mind nature is now largely become integrated with this inner. More of this, not just the essence, is carried over. Effectively, what it would mean, to use Sri Aurobindo's vocabulary where he says psychic personality, it means the psychic personality begins to infuse into the mind and in the vital to such a degree that the surface personality is literally led by this and formed out of this. We are becoming more and more the soul's influence that fills and leads and carries the personality. And then this mental personality and life personality would subsist without dissolution from birth to birth. They would be, in this sense, immortal, persistently surviving, continuous in their sense of identity. I know I am still the same person, but now I am a different type of person. You see, in your life you will see you've gone through many phases. When you were a child to your parents, you had a different personality and different relationship with them. You came into adulthood, your personality and your relationships with them were different, literally like a different person. And then when they grow old and become dependent, your relationship with them changes. And you become the parent to them, even in to some extent. In all these three, to take three because they are the most dramatically different, you still have the sense of continuity of I. And yet, if you look at the way your personality has changed, you will say, I am a different person now. Don't blame me for what I did when I was a child. I was just a child then. Or in my late age, don't blame me in my youth, because at that time I was a young person. I didn't have the maturity I have now. And if this is now taken into the next life, you will say, well, don't blame me for what was the form of my personality in that past life. I have grown through all that and I am still the same person, but I'm a different person. So the sense of continuity is there, and yet the personality and the way it engages would be different. In this sense, it is immortal, not needing to go through dissolution, but both for the mind and the life. Now, in practice, Sri Aurobindo is speaking of both. In practice, more of the mind, less of the life may be plastic enough and therefore carried. Over time, both could become equally plastic depending on how much we are able to work on these. But what happens to the rest, the body? So before we take that up, Sri Aurobindo concludes what this would result in from the evolutionary perspective. He says, this would be evidently an immense victory of soul and mind and life over the inconscience and the limitations of material nature. Who has won over what? The thing which is preventing you from integrating with the soul's consciousness, the thing which is binding you into narrowness, rigidity, and cutting you off from the deeper presence, is the strong influence of the material body nature and the inconscience upon which it is built. So the thing opposing is first inconscience, capital I, and he uses this in a very general way as a universal base. Inconscience is the base into which your soul with its mind and life substance has entered. It's not just this body nature, it is the very nature of matter into which you've come. What that means is, when you take birth, In the very act of entering matter, there is a dulling. Not just from the brain's lack of development, but in the very ambience of the material world. Entering it, one feels almost at first a kind of suffocation. The mother spoke of this in a different context. She said, somebody was telling her, are you troubled by such and such events? And she said, no, what bothers me, what is suffocating is the falsehood that is in the world. But the nature of this physical domain is everything is as if bound in narrowness, darkness, and in the rigidity of the material, of the substance itself, is the disconnection from the divine, because it stays persistently rigid when the divine is always changing, and therefore it is so different as to be even false. So the nature of the material domain is literally dullness, falsehood, and contradiction to the divine, and this is this which he calls the inconscience. It's not even conscious that the divine exists. It's not even conscious that it is a part of the divine. It's not even conscious that it is evolving. It is simply dull, rigid fixity of matter. Now it's a very dark way of looking at it, but this is the reality when you look at matter in itself. What gives to matter value is the very light that enters into it, lifts matter for a while, raises it into life and mind, and turns to higher values, and brings in touch with the divine. But the inertia of the universal inconscience is so great that you may lift this for a while, that will pull it down eventually. It says, all right, you want to play, go on. And eventually, okay, that's enough. And everything collapses. That kind of power that the inconscience has is the reason why life entering matter has to go through the cycle of birth and death in matter. It can pull out a piece of matter, make it alive, and eventually the inconscience says, enough, and it starts pulling back, and the matter begins to degenerate and collapse. So it's as if there is a sustained pull from inconscience against any effort of the spirit to lift into light of spirit. And there's a struggle. The mother spoke of this in a series of images that she asked the bodybuilders to perform. And I don't remember the exact steps of it, but the idea was the divine light or spirit reaches out to matter which is sleeping at first. So the bodybuilder is lying down, the other one reaches his hand. And then it invites it to play, and for a while matter rises but then hesitates. And only when spirit can demonstrate that it is more powerful than matter, then matter yields. And then they become friends and they work together. Sri Aurobindo puts it in different terms. He puts it this way, that only the supramental consciousness, which is the origin of the division, from which the division emerges, which leads to matter eventually, only the unity of the supramental can overcome the inertia and opposition of matter. And therefore that power must descend all the way into matter to make it yield. In between, though, are intermediate powers, the overmental and the intuitive, and then the mind itself and life energy, all of which have come in and taken up matter and awakened in it possibilities, and that's what's built up this wonderful universe that we see. But everything is somehow tainted by the nature of inconscience which pulls it down. So what you see is a gigantic struggle. From above, a continuous movement of drawing up, and from below, a sustained movement of declining to break down. Again allowing to draw up, again breaking down. And so you have the cyclic tendency. It's as if in this battle, now a great breakthrough has taken place, where soul and mind and life have made an immense victory over the inconscience. When this is achieved, how did it happen? because of the soul's influence, because of the integration of these outer layers of personality with the inner, which allows the soul now to carry this without needing to fall back entirely into the collapse that matter was so far compelling. And so, a great, immense victory, he says. This would be evidently an immense victory of soul and mind and life. All three have won. Of course, it was led by the soul, and the mind now aligning sufficiently to the soul instead of to the inconscience. Life aligning sufficiently to soul instead of inconscience. So now mind and life have joined with soul enough that together the three of them have won this immense victory. But then he puts two things: over the inconscience and the limitations of material nature. And this is something more subtle. While over time life and mind have created this body, the character of the body formed out of matter, infused with life, infused with consciousness of mind, is still largely based on limitations of inconscience. So when life, which is immortal, enters matter, it becomes mortal and has to go through death and rebirths. When mind, which is otherwise free and clear and infinite in its working, enters matter, it becomes finite and dull and clouded. This is the character of material nature. As long as you re-enter the body, you'll find this tendency bound to the body itself. And now this is more than separate from the inconscience, which was universal. This is the matter of your body as a vehicle. This vehicle has been evolving. And in its evolution, it has also formed specialized containers. So, for example, according to heredity, there are bodies which are naturally more supple. There are bodies which are naturally more aware, which have a richer spread of the nervous system and the fine nerve endings on the skin surface. It makes the body more conscious. This is interesting. The body is capable of feeling and being more sensitive, not only to its own sensations, but even to an influence from above. Or there are bodies which are very strong but not sensitive. They're resilient as vehicles for the spirit, but not necessarily receptive to everything that the spirit brings. And then the evolution works to join these two, sensitive and strong, which can also bring a support for the mind, which is more plastic, more free and clear, less dull, and so on. So you can look at this as another part of the struggle. From above, the effort of soul and mind and life to take this material nature and make it more plastic, more conscious, more fit as a vehicle for embodying the powers of the divine consciousness of the soul. And today in our human evolution, we have come to this point where all of humanity, with a very small limitation of exceptions, all of humanity is capable of conscious, self-aware, rational thought. And this was not the case if you go back 2000 years ago. There were a few who were capable of rational thought, coming into its own and saying, hey, it's so much fun to think logically. And there were others who said, what are you doing, wasting your time in this fantasizing of your thoughts? And you have the example in Greece of Socrates catching people in the marketplace to provoke them to thinking by throwing ideas. But equally, having developed the intellect, you will find many centers across different cultures turning it to still higher possibilities. In the Zen tradition, for example, having come into self-aware conscious mind, can you break the limits of the mind? And so there is the koan, a theme on which the mind can meditate, but which slips out from the mind's grasp if you dwell upon it. And you're forced to exceed the limits of this intellect which is self-aware. The one example is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? So you can think of sound of two hands clapping. What is one hand clapping? And for a moment, your mind is clouded, confused. Hey, what's this? It doesn't fit in my physical realm. You can rationalize, and then beyond rationality, there's something almost intuitive, which can feel what it's like. And when you begin to feel what it's like for one hand to be clapping, you don't have words to express it. It's as if the sound, which is silence, but an active silence of one hand, it's doing something and yet it's not making a sound. And you can feel it in the intuitive consciousness. Then you try to articulate it. And in this very process, you see around the world nudging, pushing forward. But the overall substance of human nature has, through all these old cycles, been raised up enough that today we can say all of us are capable of conscious, self-aware center of mind that says, I will take charge of my own thought. At least it's capable of that. If it may choose not to do, that's different. So this is part of that struggle from above, pulling material nature into higher and higher grades. And then it uses the human mind to turn upon other lower forms of material nature. Not only the biology, but also plant life, and lifting it. In animals, you see, when they come too close to human beings, they become more mentalized. Plants now, which are in active interchange with human beings, also becoming more mentalized. Even to the extent that a human being has also a spiritual or psychic touch, it too can be awakened in the animals or in the plants in a significant way that accelerates their evolution. And so, through this process of the soul, psychic being, taking a large part of the mental personality and the vital personality into the next, a tremendous, immense victory of soul, mind and life over the inconscience, but also the limitations of material nature. We have now outgrown and pushed beyond those limitations in an immense victory. Now matter is unable to dull you to zero, so that you have to start afresh. Your human nature now as a vehicle is unable to prevent you from losing all sense of continuity. And as a result, human nature itself will be lifted up by this influence. I've touched upon this before, but now to elaborate it, make it more explicit. When such a conscious transition is made into the new body, the mind is already formed. It's already conscious, already carrying and aligned to the psychic aspiration and the spiritual aspiration. As it enters the physical body of the child's brain and body, it brings all this into the tissue. As that material substance now grows in its normal biological process, the pressure of this developed consciousness accelerates the body's growth. What normally in the body's rhythm would have involved the intellect awakening and coming into its own, let's say around the age of 12 or 13, might start happening 2 or 3 years earlier. When the physical body is still not fully developed, the intellect would be sufficiently developed. It would disbalance the current arrangement. You would suddenly have children who are much more conscious and in a very individualized mind, now speaking things well ahead of their biological development and age. Similar with the vital. Infusing the vital into the body would accelerate the body's own development and its plasticity and awareness and skills. Which means the physical substance of human nature, body, at the level of the body, would become more plastic, more conscious, more fit as a vehicle as a result of this first step of the soul's conquest over material nature. Take it down 2 or 3 generations. You can see how much more plastic the human body would become, how much more conscious, even to the point that it may be you are conscious of the time in which you enter the physical body. You remember what it was like perhaps to be birthing. You remember what it was like to be in the cradle, and that memory can stay all the way into adulthood. and with it carrying over all the imprint of the maturity of the previous lives. And you can see it will be a very different kind of humanity, and the possibilities here would be immense, even to the extent of carrying elements of the physical habit imprinted in the life force into the new body to make it more conscious from the very beginning. And automatically this brings us now to the last step. What about the physical body? Can it not also share in this sense of immortality of the personality? And Sri Aurobindo now takes this up. But such a survival could only persist in the subtle body. The being would still have to discard its physical form, pass to other worlds, and in its return put on a new body. The awakened mental Purusha and vital Purusha, preserving the mind sheath and the life sheath of the subtle body, which are usually discarded, would return with them into a new birth and keep a vivid and sustained sense of a permanent being of mind and life, constituted by the past and continuing into the present and future. But the basis of physical existence, the material body, could not be preserved even by this change. Now, in the process of highlighting that the body is not being carried, he describes what is really happening and what is being carried. The mind sheath and life sheath of the subtle body. Remember, the subtle body consists of everything which is not the gross physical. It includes to some extent the subtle physical, and then primarily the life energy body and the mind body. Now all of these which are formed with a complex aura, which is the personality as seen and felt in the mind and vital, all of that normally is allowed to dissolve when the soul withdraws, taking the essence of the experience. But now all this would be carried and as if absorbed around the psychic being as it goes into rest. The psychic being itself in a state of psychic slumber, but this material, this substance around it, gathered in as if condensed or compressed around it. Looking at the psychic being, therefore, you will notice this one is more evolved because it has a more clear formed boundary of the vital and mental substance and personality, like a clothing, two sheets, condensed, compressed, absorbed into itself, but still seen and felt around and supporting the psychic substance. Another psychic being doesn't have any of it. It's almost naked, bare, less developed, less mature, less evolved. You see how this leads you now to the obvious next two steps, which I will elaborate now, referring to what Mother says. She says in the supramental body, the form would reveal the state of consciousness. And the clothing, so to say, would be an expression of your consciousness, your quality of thoughts, emotions, and the maturity of your personality. Okay? The less mature people would be as if naked, bared of clothes, or with very thin or fine clothes. Now you see how this fits completely with this image of the psychic being. And in between is the linking idea where she says, what will the supramental body be made of? It is this psychic being materializing itself, becoming the substance of mind, life, and eventually physical matter. That would be the material of the supramental body. And it would naturally, therefore, in its form, in its expression, hold the condensed reflection or representation of its maturity as these sheaths, in this triple layering. That's your clothing, so to say. If you think about this, they're very interesting insights, very interesting suggestions. Look at the current relationship we have with our clothing. And you get an interesting connection there also. In our formal social relations, Our clothing also are meant to represent our role or our feelings or our thoughts or our sense of self. A person who wears torn, dirty clothes does not care much for what people think of him or what he is internally. He may say, I don't care, but the part of which he doesn't care is therefore shabby, uncouth. But if he cares, then automatically he takes pains that the form of his dress reflects some of that. When you play a particular role in a social context, the clothing changes to reflect that role. The role of authority often has this form above the head, thicker, larger, more embellished clothing. The sense of a staff representing power. You will see this in all cultures. Variations are only of details of form, but the idea that you have this, because these are in fact reflections in physical form of our internal energy in the subtle body. It's something which needs more elaboration, but when internally our energy grows and the maturity grows, literally in the subtle body we see fine layers, lines, shapes above the head, around the shoulders, around the centers of the chakras. Similarly, greater light, greater form and distinction of some energy. And often these are made to reflect in our surface forms and clothing. I leave it at that to show you that nature has already suggested in the human consciousness a direction of where that is going to be. Except that currently our clothing is pretentious. It conceals more than it reveals. We put on a clothing to appear before others rather than to reveal what we are. When we are with friends, we put on clothes that reveal our state. I'm feeling unhappy today, my clothing will tend to be less colorful. I'm feeling joyous, my clothing will tend to reflect it in more ranges of color or whatever it is. But that idea now becomes complete when the personality is your clothing, you as the psychic being, and your personality as your clothing, your mind, your vital and your physical are the triple layer of your clothing, now condensed and reflecting in their condensation in the supramental body. What your consciousness is revealing, nothing is concealed. But in that state, when the psychic being withdraws and takes these two layers in its personality, it's the same idea. They're as if like layers of clothing now, held, condensed, compressed, and then again expanded and deployed as the mind again expands and prepares to take the birth. So, preserving the mental sheath and the life sheath of the subtle body, which are usually discarded. But still, returning into a new birth, it will keep a vivid and sustained sense of permanent being of mind and life constituted by the past. It's still the same me. And continuing into the present and future. And I know I will continue now into the next few lives. I do not fear anymore the nature of the transition because it is no more a blank. We fear death because for us death is like a blanking, a sense of loss of awareness, loss of memory, or loss of sense of continuity. The moment we have a first experience of the psychic presence, that fear goes away. Because now you know you will never die. Yes, you will lose the personality and memory, it's okay, but you will never die. But now in the personality itself, you have this sense of continuity. It's as if the psychic influence is now filling the personality and making it a part of its immortality. Remaining is the last layer. But the basis of physical existence, the material body, could not be preserved even by this change. The physical being could only endure if by some means its physical causes of decay and disruption could be overcome. And at the same time it could be made so plastic and progressive in its structure and in its functioning that it would answer to each change demanded of it by the progress of the inner person. So literally your body would have to become as plastic as necessary for the demand of the true person, but also the decay and disruption tendencies in the physical would have to be overcome. Otherwise, this survival is only in the subtle body. In the subtle body, one could come very close to the physical, include even elements of the subtle physical perhaps. But still, this would remain as the last boundary remaining. So, this has again important implications. He says, it must be able to keep pace with the soul in its formation of self-expressive personality, its long unfolding of a secret spiritual divinity, and the slow transformation of the mental into the divine mental or spiritual existence. And this would be, he describes later as the triple immortality. So what this means for the body, and what in the body is there now that we could assist it to overcome the tendency of decay and disruption, and to help it to become as plastic as necessary for this progress of the inner person, to be able to use it without needing to break it down. What is the requirement? And this work Sri Aurobindo has pointed to in some of his last few articles, and the mother has elaborated upon in some of her discussions in the agenda, where she was working on the cells and turning the cellular consciousness to accept the soul's immortality as against the influence of the inconscience, to which they have primary habitual allegiance. So we'll look at some of those passages also and understand what he is pointing to here. And it will be a fascinating exploration, keeping in mind that this is destined, if not with this body, into the next, if not the next, in the next, but in a relatively short span of time. And you will see in the reference that the mother makes, she recalls Sri Aurobindo saying perhaps 300 years. It would take 300 years for this part of the transformation to become possible. But we will see those passages. What is important is the certainty within us and the inevitability of this immortality, which is triple. Even though we begin with our mind and vital, eventually this is inevitable. And then with this certainty, the realization that we can begin to take steps now, even if we cannot complete it now. The steps can be begun, and they will be worthwhile because they will be part of our mental consciousness and turn of mind, and will be carried into the next life, at least as an intention and as an influence on the body. So we can meditate on this for a few minutes.